Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Creedle. I am joined by my friend Larry Chapp for, probably the 10th or 12th episode you've done with me, Larry.
Seems like
good
quite
to
a
see
few.
you as always.
Yeah.
How are things?
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on your show again.
Absolutely.
Things are well here. How about you?
Doing well.
That's good.
I'm happy that spring is around the corner.
You
and I are both fellow lovers of warm weather, so I feel like we always start off talking about weather when we're in the winter months, but I'm excited to be emerging from those very soon.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why I like Rome so much too, is that even though it gets cold in the winter, it's cold for them is 40 degrees.
Right. Exactly. No, I was in Rome a few weeks ago, Larry, and it was cold when I landed, and I was coming, of course, from the upper Midwest here. So I landed and everyone's bundled up in coats and raincoats. It's a little bit drizzly. And I'm just walking around and, without even a jacket, because for me, it was downright tropical, It's like, man, we need some air conditioning.
Yeah, I hear you. But it's been a cold winter here, so I'm glad it's moderating now.
Yeah, definitely agreed. Well, I'm excited to dive into a couple of conversations with you. I've been thinking a lot about this phenomenon of belief and how we've seen a resurgence of belief in recent years. And you can think of any number of influencers, mostly on the right, but any number of high-profile reconverts or converts or reverts who have announced their belief in Christ or their belief in some transcendent being. And I've been thinking more about sort of how we've seen that idea, that phenomenon, that fact be instrumentalized by people on the right. And maybe by some people on the left, but I think mostly on the right, using faith almost as a cudgel, or using belief as a cudgel, or using it as a means by which to build or to rebuild civilization. And, I've not been thinking about this kind of thing with the clarity that our two writers that we're going to discuss today have done so, but I was pleased to find that Paul Kingsnorth, who's an Orthodox man, an Orthodox British man living in, I think he's living in the Republic of Ireland. Maybe he's living in Northern Ireland.
He lives in Ireland, and he's Romanian Orthodox. He converted to Romanian Orthodoxy as a young man.
Right. But I think not a super young man, because he spent a lot of his youth in the sort of Greenpeace adjacent. Yeah, in prison. Yeah, exactly. He was an maybe not eco-terrorist, but he was an eco-activist and was
very
involved.
He was a big environmentalist and went all over the world protesting this, that, and the other thing in terms of environmental causes. And it kind of led him to start writing books and then pieces on not just the environment, but then leading into deeper questions of the human soul and psyche and mythology and symbolology and so on. And then eventually, he becomes a Romanian Orthodox. Why Romanian Orthodoxy? I have no idea, but
I think with a lot of those, there are certainly instances where your grandfather was Greek, so you become Greek Orthodox, or your grandmother was Romanian, and maybe there's some of that there. But I think for more of those, it has to do with the affiliation of the church that is closest to you when you're making that journey eastward. So
I was just going to say that when it comes to living in Western Europe or the UK or the United States, you want to convert to Orthodoxy, it's probably going to be the Orthodox Church most congenial to you and closest by,
right?
Because there aren't that many around,
Exactly.
So could be it. But anyway, he's Romanian Orthodox. I find him endlessly fascinating. I think he's a really, really brilliant guy, and we can talk about it. He's just gave the Erasmus lecture for First Things, where he talked about the nature of Western civilization, which he thinks is essentially moribund. It's dead. Stick a fork in it, it's done. And the role of belief in that whole structure. And he has some very interesting things to say. But Ross Douthat.
Yeah, our second writer for today. Yeah, Ross Douthat is also an adult convert, but I'm pretty sure he was a Protestant Christian and then converted to Catholicism. But he's now been sort of a public intellectual in the Catholic world for 15 or 20 years, I think, Larry. So he's pretty firmly entrenched in the Catholic world. He wrote a whole book on Pope Francis. He wrote a book, I think it was called To Change the Church. He wrote a great book on decadence. He wrote a book on, I think on sort of his medical journey and Lyme disease. He wrote a book called Strange Religion, or A Bad Religion, I think.
And I think it was called Bad Religion. Yeah. Something like that.
And then his most recent one is called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. So we're going to talk about an opinion editorial piece by him that serves as kind of a teaser for his book, I think, but it appeared in the pages of the Free Press just a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to talk about those two pieces, Against Christian Civilization by Paul Kingsnorth and Everyone Should Believe in God by Ross Douthat. Now, I don't think we had mentioned the title of the Kingsnorth piece before, Larry. You mentioned that he gave the Erasmus lecture. This piece is basically a written version of his lecture, but it's quite a startling thing to go give the annual December Erasmus lecture at First Things and call it Against Christian Civilization. But that's exactly what Kingsnorth decides to do. And his argument is really interesting. He opens with this beautiful vignette about Little Bighorn. And he said he visited Little Bighorn last time he was in America, and he's been there. It was a snowy day. The landscape was vast and white and still, as he says. And he was struck by what the people who were at Little Bighorn must have felt at the site of, or on the day of Custer's last stand. This is where the massacre happened. Let me just read to you a little bit of an excerpt here, and this gives you a taste for Kingsnorth's writing if you're not familiar with it. Standing in the snow, looking up the ridge of the monuments and the graves, I tried to imagine the psychic reality of living through the end of your culture. I tried to imagine being an Indian who faced not only the trauma of land theft and a future of being forced onto reservations, but also the harder to bear psychic wound of losing your entire metaphysics, of seeing everything you thought you knew about the world, about your people, about your land, about the shape of the universe, its gods and spirits disintegrating beneath you. I realized as I stood there that America did not just take the Indians' land. It took their entire world, outer and inner. Now, as you know, you're reading that as an American who, quite frankly, Larry, referring to myself, has tired of the narrative that, the American colonists were just the most unique colonizers and usurpers of territory who ever existed. I get a little bit squeamish and just think, yeah, I've heard these narratives a lot. But he has a point here. And of course, he goes on in the next paragraph to say, look, America is not the first country to do this. The history of the world is actually civilizations rising and falling and conquering each other.
His main point isn't, dances with wolves, look at the peaceful Indian, Hey, at least I actually like that movie. And at least that movie shows violence between tribes. I mean, it doesn't paint the entire Native American world as this place of bucolic, wonderful, romantic peace.
Just growing corn.
They were they put each other into slavery. They brutalized in genocidal ways each other. Yeah, so that's not his point. His point is, you know what? We did mistreat them. Number one, we did mistreat Native Americans. Regardless of what they did to each other, we mistreated them. Absolutely. And on top of that, deeper point, what is it like to be at the sort of fin de cycle moment, an end of an era moment where you realize your entire metaphysics has been robbed from you? It'd be like all of a sudden somebody comes forward with incontrovertible proof beyond any shadow of a doubt that Jesus Christ was a complete fraud, his mother was a prostitute, that he did not rise from the dead, and blah, blah, then you could prove this. I mean, it would demolish Christianity. And just imagine how our universe would completely fall apart, metaphysics and what existentially and psychically and psychically. And I think this is the kind of point that he's making, which is we're not at that point, obviously, and we can never be, because historical proof can never rise to that level of certitude. But the point is that I think he's trying to say that we're kind of reaching a point where all of the metaphysical underpinnings of our view of existence have been eviscerated by modernity, by Western civilization as we know it. And we need to deal with that.
Right, exactly. And so he's drawing a parallel between the Christian of today, who lives in a time and a place where Christian civilization, whatever that word once meant, no longer exists. He's also doing something interesting in sort of setting us up to understand the title of his piece, Against Christian Civilization, because his lecture is not called The End of Christian Civilization or Christian Civilization is Dead. It's actually called Against Christian Civilization. And he ties into this vignette about Native Americans by talking about a man named Charles Alexander Eastman, or as he says, to use the name he was given by his people, the Santi Dakota Ohayesa. So he was a Dakota Native American. His birth name in his tribe was Ohayesa, but he became anglicized or Americanized through, again, usurpation and colonization, and he became Charles Alexander Eastman. And this guy has a fascinating biography. I did not know about him before I read this lecture, but he ended up basically fully assimilating. He became a doctor. He went to medical school to become a doctor. He traveled a lot around America, and he also became a Christian. Most relevant to our narrative here. And he wrote an autobiography called "The Soul of an Indian," where he reflected upon his spiritual journey, and he reflected on the path of his people, or at least what was his people in the Dakota. And at the end of his life, he says, let's see. So at the end of his life, this is Kingsnorth now writing, he did not reject Christianity or Christ, neither did he cease to think of himself as an American. But he came to see something about his faith that perhaps only someone of his background could have seen. At the end of his life story, he tells us what it is. Quote, this is from Eastman/Ohayesana. It is my personal belief, after 35 years' experience of it, that there is no such thing as Christian civilization. I believe that Christianity and modern civilization are opposed and irreconcilable, and the spirit of Christianity and of our ancient religion is essentially the same. We're now ending Ohayesa's quote, and we're back to Kingsnorth. Today, it is the Europeans and the Americans who are experiencing cultural and metaphysical collapse. The West is undergoing its own loss of a sense of self and culture, of history and stability. After centuries of global hegemony, it is our turn to experience the fear of such a loss, the fear of decline and fragmentation. All right, so what do you make of that claim by Ohayesa, Larry, that there's no such thing as Christian civilization because Christian ideas, Christianity, and modern civilization are opposed and irreconcilable?
Well, I think he's obviously right in a lot of ways, but potentially wrong. Obviously, there was at one time in our past, I don't think there's any way you could deny, one time in Europe's past, there was a thing called Christian civilization. Something has to explain the great cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, places like this. I mean, something has to explain the emergence of a Dante. And so, I mean, come on, there was a Christian civilization. But it seems to me that the deeper claim is that whatever it may have been, it no longer exists because modernity is irreconcilable with Christianity. And I have a great sympathy with that point of view. I do. And I write about it all the time. In fact, I'm writing a blog post right now, in essence, on the de facto atheism inherent in modern culture. And its irreconcilability with the faith. And to the extent that Christianity has become infected with that same de facto atheism, it's actually a very deficient form of Christianity. So I agree with him. I think there is deep toxicity towards the faith embedded in modern culture. Now, all that said, I also have sympathy with the, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, the thesis put forward by Tom Holland in his book Dominion and others, that in point of fact, modern culture is still in some sense Christian. That Christianity is a victim of its own success, that the revolution that it injected into the world was so universal, so pervasive, so deep, that it's absolutely correct to say there's the world before Christianity and there is the entire world after Christianity. And therefore, modern so-called secular values like equality before the law and the dignity of the individual and the rights of conscience and the rights of religion, these are all motivated by Christian ideals. And that the Jeffersonian sort of phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created. The problem with that is, no, it's not self-evident. It seems self-evident to the writers of the Declaration of Independence, but it's not self-evident. It's the product of Christian culture. Now, that's gone off the rails, and even Holland would acknowledge that, right? It's gone off the rails, but it's gone off the rails in the sense that it's a kind of Christianity devoid of the cross, Christianity devoid of its supernatural elements. And now the bankruptcy that Kingsnorth talks about, the bankruptcy of our metaphysical world and our metaphysical ideals, is that our culture is finally coming to realize that all of these things that we believe in really were grounded in the Christian vision of things. And therefore, the entailment to the rejection of Christianity means we have to call these things into question too, which is precisely why you're seeing the rise of things like the far alt-right and things like that, the post-Christian alt-right, all right, which is scary as hell. Because it absolutely embodies the rejection of the vestigial elements of Christianity in modern culture. So I have a complex and conflicted attitude towards modernity and its relationship with Christianity. I think it's an open historical and sociological question.
Well, we mentioned the Romanian Orthodox Church. Speaking of Romania, has nothing to do with the Orthodox Church, but speaking of Romania, we're speaking today on February 28th, Larry. Apparently just yesterday, these two brothers, have you heard of Andrew Tate? I don't even know his brother's name, but have you heard of the Tate brothers?
Yeah, I don't really know much about them. I guess apparently they're extremely controversial conservative types.
Well, I wouldn't say conservative types. They're actually, like constitutionally, they're very unconservative, but they do identify with the far right.
The far right. That's what I mean by conservative. They're like far right figures.
Yes,
that have
exactly.
strange ideas about race and women and so on. Probably.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, just ridiculous ideas. For example, I think one of the tweets from Andrew Tate over the past month was something like, "If you are a man and all of your children are with one woman, then you are not a conqueror." I mean, just absurd ideas that actually fly in the face of everything that Christianity has taught us about the goodness of marriage, for example. But worse than that, even worse than sort of just pontificating with stupid ideas on Twitter that would be compelling only to morons. Andrew is also, and I think his brother is being investigated by the government of Romania for sex trafficking. And as I understand
that's what I read. That's what I read about them. Yeah.
As I understand it, the allegation is that basically they were running these. They were basically running as digital pimps by running these, cam girls or something for internet audiences. So just really, really dark, nasty stuff. And some of the reporting that I've seen is that the Trump administration intervened on these guys' behalf to get them out of Romania and allow them to come to Florida. I saw the Tampa Bay Young Republicans post a tweet welcoming them to the free state of Florida because they welcome free speech, etc. And I mean, this is just repulsive, disgusting stuff that, I've long identified as a conservative, Larry, but I would, in no way ever countenance this kind of behavior. And, certainly do not want my president and his administration lobbying on behalf of accused sex traffickers to get them out of their home countries. So it's crazy. And it's sad. I think it speaks to your point about the post-Christian right and where we're going.
That's why you have this. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go for it. Go for it.
You have this division within the Trump coalition, and I'm not the first one to point this out. A previous guest on my podcast, David Dean, talked about what he termed them techno-feudalists. You have the techno-feudalists, which are like the far-right, alt-right techno guys like Elon Musk in the Trump administration. Not that Elon Musk is an alt-right neo-Nazi kind of thing, but he's got these highly secular. I mean, he's the father of 13 kids by
I think so, yeah,
different women or whatever,
Yep.
And but he's sort of made kissy face with Christianity all of a sudden in order, I think, to curry favor with Trump and to at least not appear as anti. But then you've got the other part of the Trump coalition, which really is the sort of the last remnants of what we would have called the Christian right, the Christians that voted for pro-life issues and stuff like that. They're certainly part of his coalition, but you see those two things at odds with each other within the Trump administration. And so I think Trump probably can't stand what the Tates stand for. Or maybe even doesn't.
I hope that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe even doesn't know the full extent of what it is that they stand for. All he knows is that they are the darling child of certain members of his coalition. And he doesn't want to alienate those members. So he probably got requests from certain parts of his powerful parts of his coalition, requests, please help the Tates get out of Romania. And in order to keep the peace of his coalition, he did so. That is my guess. I would hope that President Trump is not a supporter of sex trafficking, and I suspect he is not. I suspect this is the ugly side of politics. But the point is, it's making Kingsnorth's point here, and Eastman's point that there is this deep, deep, deep conflict between. Even if we want to say Even I'll go so far as to say, okay, maybe they have a point with regard to the toxic inconsistency between modernity and Christianity. But even if we wanted to say there's still some elements of the Christian legacy left in our civilization, it is now absolutely true that those two elements are now at odds with one another. The anti-Christian elements and the Christian elements are absolute, and it's sort of front and center. And it's not just in the left wing. It's not just amongst Democrats exiling pro-life Christian Democrats basically out of the parties. And no, you have to shut up. No, now we see it in the Republican Party where you see these warring factions, and it's really kind of scary to see which one might gain the ascendancy.
I completely agree with that. Your point about techno-feudalism is an interesting one, and I've been observing this a lot lately. In 2020, when Trump was ousted by Biden, it was the case that all the sort of tech money was behind Biden. In 2024, just 4 years later, that had shifted radically for, I think, a host of reasons. But it's interesting that Trump now has behind him a whole coalition of what we might call tech bros, and Elon Musk is maybe the most notorious of them, or the most famous, depending on sort of your frame of reference. But Sam Altman, who is the head of OpenAI, who's trying to achieve this artificial general intelligence, is also a Trump supporter now. He's not going to don the "Make America Great Again" hat like Elon Musk does, but my understanding is that he donated to his campaign. He was put in charge of this big coalition overseeing AI at the behest of the federal government just a month ago. JD Vance himself has a background in venture capital and the tech world. Mark Zuckerberg has come around. He's not explicitly stated support for Trump, but on various podcast appearances, people have been able to sort of read between the lines and recognize this guy's now a Trump guy.
He and Bezos are just afraid.
Yeah. No, I think JD Vance I like JD so far. I sometimes wish that he was a little bit more strained on Twitter and sort of gets himself into trouble there. But I think he is a genuine guy. I think he is a Catholic who's trying to do good and follow the truth. With these other,
I think he's
go ahead.
There you got Bezos too, but I think Bezos and Zuckerberg are essentially what they did was during the Biden administration. They did the bidding of whoever was in power, which was censorship of all this so-called COVID misinformation. Now the election has shown, Americans don't really want any of that anymore, and they're anti-woke madness. And so now all of a sudden Zuckerberg and Bezos are all, Trump. I think this is all very cynical.
Well, no, you're right, because I think it was just 2 days ago, Bezos released a statement. He owns the Washington Post, as you probably know.
Now people are quitting the Post.
And he said, so this was just February 26th, he said, "I shared this note with the Washington Post team this morning. I'm writing to let you know about a change coming to our opinion pages. We are going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to be published by others. There was a time when a newspaper, yada, 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 yada."
So he's running scared.
Yeah, exactly. Running scared and sort of...
He wants to curry favor with the neo-conservative movement. But here's what's interesting about that. This is a total side comment. But, of course, everybody went berserk when he came out with that, like, oh my God, what is happening to our democracy? What is happening to journalism? Oh, for the love of Pete. Journalism has been dead for a long, long time.
I think the only people who don't think that is journalists. I think everyone else recognizes that.
As if the Washington Post hasn't engaged in that kind of censorship just on the other side of the spectrum for decades now. I mean, seriously, 98% of their opinion columns in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in Chicago's papers, Los Angeles paper. I mean, this has been documented over and over and over and over again. Huge, massive liberal bias amongst the major news outlets, print outlets, and media, for in the liberal direction. Bezos now is just making explicit what has been sort of clearly implicit for a long time. Excuse me. So anyway, that's a sidebar conversation, but I think you're right. Now there's these techno-feudalists, kind of anarcho-capitalist types who are coming forward, who I think really do envision a future America that is it's pretty much a technocracy run by techno-oligarchs in one fashion or another. And that people actually want this. I think this is what they have convinced themselves, that people want this kind of a tech revolution that will, in a sense, unleash their lives in all of these fantastic directions, and that they're willing to trade democracy in order to achieve that. I really think that's what these guys think.
Yeah. Now, if you're listening to this conversation that Larry and I are having, you might be thinking, guys, you're getting pretty far afield here, because you started talking about Against Christian Civilization by Kingsnorth, and Native American culture being decimated by American, sort of white American culture, and that being an analogy or an example of Christian culture being demolished by modernity. And now you're just talking about tech bros. But here's the linkage. Here's where I want to go next, Larry. In this Kingsnorth article, Kingsnorth makes an interesting claim about the development of civilization per se. And I ran into a similar claim last summer, and I've wrestled with it a lot in my mind, and I don't think it's quite right, but I can't really quite see the flaw in it. When I was at this New Polity conference, and I debated a guy named Mark Barnes, and I read a lot of Mark's work in preparation for this debate. So we didn't actually engage exactly with this idea in the debate, although we touched some that were sort of parallel to it. But one of Mark's claims in another piece that I've read is that basically, were it not for sin, we wouldn't build anything, right? And so, you go back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, perfect weather all the time, no need for clothing. You're protected from all these dangerous things, so you don't have need for shelter. You don't need to build houses. You don't need to clothe yourself. You don't need to build churches because you have perfect communion with God, etc. It's only with the entrance of sin into the world that we end up having to build things. And I was thinking about that claim when I was reading Kingsnorth, because he says, some time ago, a question came to me as I read through the Bible. What if God agrees with Ohayesa and this claim about Christian civilization and not really being a thing? He says at the very beginning of the very first book of the Bible, we find a claim about what a human is created to be. God scoops up soil from the ground, breathes into it, and humans appear. We are raised from the ground naked and placed in a garden to tend and keep it in communion with all that lives, in conversation with all the birds and animals. Humans, it turns out, were created as vegetarian gardeners. We were created to be so close to God that we could see him walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. Skipping down a few lines, well, that's not how things turned out. And when we disobeyed, what happened? Farming happened, work happened, hunting happened, metalwork happened, murder happened, cities happened.
Cities happened.
Civilization happened. It was all a deadly result of our fall. I guess let's start there. Do you think that's true, that we would not have cities were it not for the fall? Because I also think about the New Jerusalem, right? We have a biblical picture of a city that is literally representative of Zion, spelled out very clearly in scriptures. So I understand the argument. I don't think I fully buy it, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
I don't agree with it at all. Because the creative impulse in the human being, like all of our impulses, our entrepreneurial impulse, our creative impulse, all these impulses have been perverted by sin, but not utterly corrupted by it. And so, yeah, we build cities, but we build cities now riddled with the libido dominandi, and do so as our motivation. Death then imposes too upon our life an awareness of our finitude. And so part of our sinful motivation to do anything is it's our attempt to rise above the finality of death, to leave our mark somehow and say, okay, my life has meaning, even though it's meaningless, because I built this pyramid or whatever. That will be my lasting legacy. But the fact is, come on. The fact is, look at some of the greatest saints in the history of the church. They were builders of great things. They were achievers of great things. And I don't think that they were motivated by sinful impulses or were simple necessity. Okay, we're naked and it's cold outside, so I'm going to make clothing for myself. No, I think the saints show us, it goes beyond. If you meditate even for 1 second upon when God made human beings, male and female, and looked upon them and said, this is good, this is the capstone of my creation. He endowed us with all of these preternatural virtues. I think what Kingsnorth here is envisioning is human nature stripped of sin, but not replaced with virtue. All right. And so he's simply looking at sinful human beings and saying, what are the motivations that sinful human beings have to make things? Well, the libido dominandi, material necessity, death. But then he doesn't turn around. And this is really shocking to me as someone like Kingsnorth, who is so adept at poetry and symbology, is not understanding the rich, rich, rich depth of human creativity that would have been not only would we have built these things had we never fallen, we would have made them even better. We would have built even greater things because we wouldn't have been hamstrung by the desire to dominate. You get where I'm going with this. I just think I think it's altogether wrong to say that sin is what creates our creativity.
I mean, no, I think I agree with you. When I first heard this claim, like I said, it didn't sit well with me. I see it, and it's it certainly has merit. But I think your point about that made sense to me when you said what they envision, sort of stripping away the sin, but not leaving the virtue, because I think virtue does entail some sort of creative impulse. I mean, I think about how the fact that I love my child might spur me to build a treehouse for them, and that's not a sinful impulse, right? But it's still something that requires creation. But I totally take the point that were it not for sin, the Las Vegas Strip would not exist, right? Totally makes sense to me. Got it. 100% agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If you say were it not for sin, St. Peter's or churches like it would not exist, I'm not there. Now, to see it from their side of the coin, they might say, well, yeah, but churches exist because of the need to have, an altar to mediate between us and God. And that's true in our current understanding of churches, but I think even in the heavenly Jerusalem, will we be able to build things for God? Will we be able to build, monuments to God, or express our love for God with works of creation that are wrought by our own hands? I think so. I hope so.
Yeah, and I think a lot of biblical exegetes would call into question that it is a very old and standard interpretation that a lot of people have given to the Genesis narrative. Cain and Abel, that one represents agriculture, Cain, and Abel represents the simple nomadic culture of original Judaism. And Cain murders Abel. That's a symbol of the evil of agriculture. And then
the guy using the technology,
yeah, he uses the tech, and then the cities that get formed are the result of sin and so on. There is an element of that in the narrative, but it's not the main point. And I know a lot of biblical exegetes would say that that's not what's going on in this narrative. And I mean, especially since the prophetic literature, which in many ways it's the later prophetic redactors that created these Genesis narratives, were also the creators of that biblical image of the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven and so forth. And so that's their way of saying the problem isn't with cities as such. The problem is with sinful cities. And someday we're going to live in a glorious city. So I don't know. I think I know what Kingsnorth is. We have to keep in mind, Kingsnorth is a radical environmentalist. And I, too, am an environmentalist. And I live on a farm and all that sort of stuff. But I do think that sometimes Kingsnorth's analysis is tainted with a certain Luddite anti-technological impulse, that there is an inherent evil in technological civilization, an inherent evil in industrial civilization. There is an inherent evil in almost all major human constructions of some kind, and that there is this built-in, therefore, because of our sin, built-in competition between human creativity and nature as such, that they are sort of at odds with one another, and that we seek to implement. Now, as a phenomenological description of what sin has done to our relationship with nature, there's a truth to it, but I think he sometimes goes too far, and I think it's tainted by a certain anti-technological animus.
I think that's probably true. It's also probably why I like reading him so much, because I tend to have a pro-technological bias. I ever since I was a kid, I've loved going on tech blogs. I've loved playing with gadgets. I've loved learning how to code, and so I've figured these things out or been taught them and have really enjoyed them. But in my adulthood, I've been much more cautious about that. And
I will say this: I want to be very clear. I share Kingsnorth's suspicions about industrial techno-civilization. Anybody that's ever written anything I've ever written knows that's why I love Kingsnorth. I think he's kind of right about all of this stuff. I simply bring that up in order to call into question his exegesis of Genesis.
Yeah, makes sense.
Which I think is being driven by. That's why I love that interpretation of Scripture that he gives, because I'm driven by the same thing. But I know the biblical exegetes are all screaming bloody murder. That no, that's not really what the story's about.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Well, let's go on to the next part of his essay here, which ties into what Ross Douthat says in his article, and I presume in his book, although I've not yet read the book. Kingsnorth asks. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, though. It looks really good. And Douthat's such a great writer. He just write with crystal clarity. I always appreciate the things I read by him. So Kingsnorth says, what we call religion is perhaps best described as a collection of tools and mechanisms that we use here on earth to direct that reverence and wonder toward its proper end, God, not culture. And it seems here that he's sort of sub-quoting Christopher Lasch, who he quotes directly in the previous article. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then he says there are basically 5 common attitudes. If we look at people around the world today and sort of how they, self-identified religious people today, just people today. If we look at people today, there are basically 5 common attitudes around religion. The first is increasingly common, and that's scientific atheism, right? And he said, this is not the old atheism. This is the new atheism. This is the sort of dominated by materialism and burden of proof argumentation against the people who do have religion. He says in this telling, religion is wrong because it's just primitive falsehoods based on absolutely nothing, mere superstition. Right? That's the first category, scientific atheism. Yeah. The second is the liberal relativist. And he says the liberal relativist, quote, tells us that all religions are fine if kept in their place. Maybe all religions are the same. There are many paths up the mountain after all. So the liberal relativist, I mean, you I'm sure you know many people like this. It seems like a very common thing to be for someone who's 25 years old, because they don't want to say anyone is wrong. They often recognize implicitly through some intuition that there is some transcendent truth to the universe. So let's just say that sort of there are many equally valid paths to God. Liberal relativism. The third one is serious religion. This is in Kingsnorth telling kind of the religion of the true believer. Like this, what I believe is actually true. This is the way to heaven or to fulfillment, whatever your religion is, right? Nirvana, etc. The fourth is cultural religion, and that is where I go to church on Christmas and Easter. Maybe I wear a keffiyeh or a headscarf because this is sort of what my culture does, but I don't really believe it. It's just I recognize the value of it, in sort of adhering to the things that my parents did. And then there's the fifth one, which he's primarily concerned about in this essay, and that is civilizational religion. Let me just quote: "This phenomenon comes to the fore in times of upheaval or crisis, seeing that the culture is in trouble and understanding that a particular religion was at its heart. The civilizational religionist seeks to use religion to rebuild culture regardless of its truth." And the astute listener will probably recognize this is kind of the linchpin of what he's saying here in this Against Christian Civilization, because what he's primarily concerned about is people who are identifying with Christianity and pretending to act on its impulses or on its behalf to build this thing called civilization that ultimately, in Kingsnorth understanding, and I would agree with him, will actually undermine Christianity and ultimately undercut it. And Douthat's saying much the same thing in his article. He, for example, is quoting Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, if you know him, he's a previous Muslim, ex-Muslim, for a long time was a critic of religious fundamentalism. And I think, if not atheist, was certainly agnostic, was certainly not a public Christian or anything like it. And just last year, she announced that she had become a Christian. And Douthat uses this and several other stories to explore this sort of phenomenon of recent, very public, high-profile figures who have come to, we'll just say, sort of a public statement of faith without any indication that they actually believe it to be true, but clearly motivated by a desire to return to something like what they believe is Christian civilization. So we need to adhere to Christian values because that is how we save the family. That is how we recover marriage from divorce rates that are making it absolutely crumble. We need to return to Christianity because that is how we rebuild our education system, or that is how we sort of reclaim our Western culture from the wave of immigrants that are taking us over in Europe, for example. Those ideas are the ones that are often, in many cases, driving this return to civilizational Christianity. And that's what Douthat's concerned about. That's also obviously what Kingsnorth is concerned about. So what do you think about that, Larry?
First off, I love Kingsnorth's taxonomy of the various types. I would add one, though, and I'm sure it would be a subset of one of his categories, which is the radical religious indifferentism of a very apophatic agnosticism, deeply apophatic agnosticism that would not just say all religions are equal paths to God, but all religions are equally trivial. Not just they're equally true, they're equally trivial, and that ultimately God is this, if God exists, is unknowable. And thus all of these sorts of religious questions are kind of bogus and almost a distraction, and an annoying distraction to the business of constructing society. So there is a kind of aggressive indifferentism here, aggressive apophaticism of the indifferent that I think actually is one of the predominant characteristics of modern religion in the United States. That radical apophaticism, which leads to an inability to truly commit oneself to the faith, even when one sees civilizational value in those things. And I think this is Ross Douthat is he's saying we need to be patient with converts of various kinds and not put all kinds of look for the perfect convert before we praise their conversion. I think he's right about that. We shouldn't call into question whether or not someone is converting because they see civilizational value in in converting. And Kingsnorth is right about that. And then, in some sense, too, that Christianity can build a civilization, but we have to be careful in this regard that civilization is really built on faith and not just, these are the values we want to create so that Christianity is viewed as a noble lie, all this. All right. But where Douthat gets really interesting in this article, excuse me, is where he's clearly, he doesn't mention him by name, but I wish he had. He's clearly being critical of Jordan Peterson. When he talks about, take, for example, a well-known psychologist. Well, Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, a well-known psychologist who goes on and on about biblical symbols and biblical motifs and blah, blah, blah.
But literally exactly what Peterson does, yeah.
That's what Peterson has been doing. It's why Bishop Barron loves him, and I kind of like him too, and so on. And I like the fact that he wears suits that are so psychedelic and make Herb Tarlick blush, if you can remember who Herb Tarlick was. But anyway, the fact is, then Ross Douthat goes on to characterize these types as people, believers in belief. They believe in belief, but they don't have belief themselves. And he calls them out, much in the same way I think that Kingsnorth calls out civilizational Christianity. That you can't, if you're going to use Christianity as a noble lie, to simply build up virtues within a civilization that you want emphasized, you are undermining both civilization and Christianity, because such a Christianity cannot be sustained unless you find, that's why he wrote his book, he says, the new book, unless you actually come finally around to saying, you know what, I'm a Christian because I think that stuff happened. I think it's real. I believe through faith in its reality. And that's simply what Jordan Peterson and people like him cannot bring themselves to acknowledge. That brings me back to the apophaticism, the religious indifferentism of a kind of radical apophaticism. I think Jordan Peterson cannot bring himself to religious faith, and others like him, and why the civilizational Christian thing is a failed project. Christianity is a noble lie, a tool. It's because I think Jordan Peterson thinks that these are unanswerable questions. Religion provides us with this great wealth of mythopoesis and symbolology that we can possibly tap into for its wisdom. Remember, he's a psychologist and he's seeking wisdom about the human psyche and the human condition, and he thinks religion has a certain insight. But that it tells us actually something about God, who knows? Who knows? And I think I would venture a guess and say Jordan Peterson is got in his soul a kind of agnostic apophaticism.
I think that's right. I said something like this on Twitter to somebody a couple weeks ago. They were talking about how many people like to sort of interpret the acts of these like techno-feudalist folks in rather apocalyptic terms. And I was talking about how I think Peterson does a similar thing, but in interpreting the Bible and interpreting theology and sort of commenting on Christian theology, I've seen him get the order wrong. So he'll say, for example, we should study the Exodus because the Exodus tells us all these things that are true about human nature and about our time today. And so he looks into history for sort of mimetic explanations about where we are today and the time and age in which we are living and the people with whom we interact. But what really is happening is that we are living through a series of events that are historically located and actually incarnate, all of which point us not to just, echoes of the same thing that happened previously, but actually the one true foundational reality that undergirds the whole thing. And so I think he ends up in this sort of like self-referential circle that is ultimately agnostic because he can't bring himself to religious faith. And there's a sort of hubris there too, right? To recognize, to say like, yeah, we can draw on all the wisdom of the people who came before us, except for the one thing that they were most convinced of, right?
Yeah.
We can look at all the wonderful works of literature and music and poetry and mathematics and architecture that they did, but we'll just reject the one thing that they took the most seriously because that doesn't really make sense. That's not helpful to us now.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, Jordan Peterson and those like him remind me a lot of a guy from an earlier generation, Joseph Campbell. I don't even remember. Joseph Campbell was, he was like the guy on PBS. It was all these PBS specials and so forth. He was a professor essentially of mythology, of the history of human mythology.
Okay.
And he was a great expositor of the deep significance of the mythopoesis of the human mind and the religion and so forth. But at the end of the day, he believed in nothing. At the end of the day, he was just a secularist.
Wow.
with a certain penchant for, spirituality of some kind. So my point is, these types are not necessarily all that new. They've been around for a while. Jordan Peterson is just sort of the biggest example of it now. But
I wonder, to Kingsnorth's point, I wonder if what Kingsnorth calls the civilizational Christian, or what Douthat calls the believer in belief, that's not new, to your point, but I wonder if it's more prevalent now, precisely because Christian civilization, I'm using the scare quotes right now, which we can also, which I think many people would sort of say is synonymous with Western civilization, is perceived as being under attack in a particular sort of way. It is clearly on the decline for demographic reasons, if nothing else. And now we have a sort of resurgence of this sort of believer in belief, precisely for the instrumental purposes of saving it. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that is true. What you're seeing is the intellectual bankruptcy of liberalism, who for decades and decades, if not centuries, have maintained a notion of human rights, the rule of law, the rights of conscience, democracy, all of these sorts of things, but without any metaphysical underpinning.
Yeah.
But they got away with it because the culture was still, de facto Christian. The culture was. And so that kind of liberalism could exist sort of parasitically off of Christian, but Christian culture is dead. And so liberal values became essentially stipulative. Well, we don't believe in all that theological gobbledygook anymore, but we're still going to stipulate that human beings have fundamental rights. We don't know what they are, but we're going to stipulate that they have these rights.
Yeah.
Which accounts for why, in many ways, they become authoritarian and dogmatic in the imposition of those rights, because at the end of the day, all they have left is authority. Well, with the emergence of ultra-modernity, if you want to call it that now, the people have seen through the stipulative nature of these so-called rights, and civilization is beginning to come apart at the seams. It's beginning to come unraveled. And you see this in the rise of various you mentioned some of them and so forth, and it's scaring these people. And so they want to use Christianity in a very cynical way, in my point of view, as a prop to, let's go back to what it was like in maybe, 1910,
Yeah.
where we can have these rights and Christian society. We don't believe in any of that stuff, but we wished a lot more other people would, so that we can just go back to the way it was before. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. And Kingsnorth is right and Douthat is right. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of like the return to order impulse. How do we recover that? But I mean, I think it doesn't work because if it's built on a noble lie, it either will never work from the get-go, or it will not endure, right? Because either you won't be able to convince people of the noble lie right away, or the noble lie eventually will ring hollow, and everything that is built upon it will fall apart.
Yeah, and because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. We've spent 300 years culturally in all of our major elite institutions convincing everyone that Christianity is stupid. And now all of a sudden we want people to believe that again, in Christianity. And so we're trying to resurrect it somehow on a cultural level. But you can't undo what you've done, which, by the way, speaks to, and this is the essence of the article I'm writing right now, speaks to, if we're going to be astute readers of the signs of the times in terms of re-evangelizing culture, we need to realize that a simple reiteration of past forms isn't going to work.
Yeah.
That we have to be able to look at what is going. This is why conversations like this are so important. We've got to be able to look at the current structures of our civilization, and we have to ask ourselves, how can we re-propose the Christian faith to those values and those structures in a way that will radically call them out of themselves and transform the gospel? Fresh, creative approaches to what it means to be the church in the world have got to come out of these conversations. And I think Kingsnorth this is why I love the guy. He's all about let's start from scratch, but not start from scratch. It's the original sort of radical Christianity, with the word radical coming from radix, root. Let's go back to the roots of the faith and let's do this thing.
Yeah, there's a point in his article that I wanted to get your opinion on. I mean, one of the things I like talking to you, Larry, is because you're not afraid to use technology. You obviously write a lot of places. You have a podcast. You're on this podcast with me. You do all these guest appearances. And yet you're in Pennsylvania on your Catholic worker farm. So you very much have sort of one foot in the world, but the other one very much out of the world. And at times I want sort of that for myself. At other times I'm more realistic and just think I don't have the temperament to be a farmer and could never succeed in doing that. But Kingsnorth is talking about this. He says the essence of civilizational Christianity is the reshaping of this radically unworldly faith for very worldly ends, the defense of a certain kind of culture. The Gospels become a weapon with which to fight a culture war in a collapsing civilization, but confusing the Christian way with the way of that civilization is a fatal error. And then he has these in italics. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, love God, do not resist evil, lay down your life for your friends, rule by serving, give away your wealth, let the dead bury the dead. We have our orders and how we hate them, how I hate them. Sometimes I can't look at them or at myself in their shadow, and so we twist them. We, all of us, use them to justify war and resistance and politics and wealth and power and all the human things that these orders instruct us to walk away from. Oh yes, I know he said that, we tell ourselves, but he really meant this. But what if he meant what he said and we don't like it? As the Western collapse progresses, we all face a question. Will we follow our orders, or will we twist them again to justify our role in a coming war? It's kind of a haunting question there.
Haunting, and I couldn't agree with it more. I think it's so beautifully expressed. That encapsulates things so very, very well. So many of the political issues that we as, devout Catholics or whatever get involved in, they're important, I guess, but I'm not a political animal at all in that regard. I view these sort of fights as rearguard actions in the midst of a retreat. And rearguard actions are important in order to hold down casualties and to maybe gain some better defensive posture. Nevertheless, that's what they are. And that's what Kingsnorth is saying. These are little skirmishes, and we're not fighting the battle at its origins, at its source. The only thing that I would add to what Kingsnorth says there, he lists all of those things that we're commanded to do by Christ that would revolutionize the world. I think one thing that I would add to that is simply this. One can do all those things, And one should do all those things. But the first thing one should do, and it's really, really simple, go to church. I get emails all the time from people. How can I put into action in my life what it is that you're calling us to do? And I often say, well, learn how to walk before you run. Are you going to church? The first thing you do is go to church, get involved in your parish. And then once you get involved in your parish, start volunteering in your parish, doing things in your parish, get to know people in your parish, and then add various things that you would like to do through your parish, such as the spiritual and corporal works of mercy, which is what Kingsnorth is talking about here. And you will probably discover, especially in larger parishes, there are already ministries devoted to all of those things, into which you can interject yourself. This is how we transform our culture back into a Christian culture, not by doing comments in com boxes under articles online and so on. You need to get involved locally at your church, in your parish. And that's why I couldn't agree with Kingsnorth more, because what he's essentially saying there is the answer lies within each one of us, and each one of us needs to get involved, do stuff.
I think, I mean, I look at this and think this can I imagine it could pretty easily describe someone who is, for example, a farmer in Ireland living the bucolic life like Kingsnorth is. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, love God, do not resist evil, lay down your life for your friends, rule by serving, give away your wealth, let the dead bury the dead. I think it's harder to see, if can, for example, a professional soldier do those things. And this is where I think we have to rely on the wisdom of the Christian tradition and how it has understood Christ's words through this. There are people in the Christian tradition who have interpreted Christ's words of love your neighbor as saying, be a total pacifist. The majority of the tradition, and the greatest minds, I would argue, of the tradition, have not interpreted his words that way, and have held that, for example, you can be a soldier and a Christian, because there is such a thing as a just war. I think the challenge for me becomes, Larry, I look at these things and think, okay, well, how about this particular fight or this particular war? Is this the best way that I can love my neighbor? And, so I don't know, what's an example of this? Maybe like picking a Twitter fight is a good example. Although maybe that one's pretty easy, because normally in almost all cases, it's probably not the best way to love your neighbor is picking a Twitter fight, right? But, I don't know. Let's take another issue that's been in the news. Being leading the charge for your parents, your PTA to speak up against transgender identified minors who were born male playing in girls' sports. What's the best way to love my neighbor with respect to this thing? How much of a fuss do I make about this? How do I present myself in the PTA meeting? What does it look like? How do I say the truth with love, etc.? And when the I'm not asking you for specific answers on this, but just as as one example of how this is actually a real thing. We're in these what we call culture wars. I hate that phrase for a whole bunch of reasons, but there are these actual issues where we disagree with neighbors and where we want to stand up for what is true and what is conducive to human flourishing. How do you do that while following Jesus' commands to love your neighbor? Is it resisting evil? Is it resisting the authorities placed over you to say to your school board, no, I don't like the rule that you set up for this thing. I'm pushing it back against it, right? So when the rubber hits the road, I think it's really difficult. And I only say this, again, not to ask you for specific thoughts on that specific issue, Larry, although if you have them, feel free. But to go back to your point about starting somewhere, you cultivate holiness. Are you walking with God now? Are you going to Mass? Are you seeking spiritual direction? Are you partaking of the sacraments in the way that you should? Because when you do those things, I think all the other things become a lot more clear. And you won't get caught up in this sort of scrupulosity of like, oh, do I say this? Do I not say this? You will, be able to act empowered by the Holy Spirit. God's grace will go before you to live holiness the way you're called to. And the sacraments are there for the shortcomings.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what Kingsnorth is articulating are a broad set of principles, kind of grounded in the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And then I don't think he's trying to dictate, but here's exactly how those should be instantiated in every case. So I think you're right. The issue of just war, the issue of which prudential political battles I should fight, and so on. it has to begin with a process of discernment, and that process can only happen properly if you've put on the mind of Christ. And the only way to put on the new man, to put on the mind of Christ, is to kill the old self through various renunciations, and to educate yourself through prayer and reading, Lectio Divina, and so on, to give yourself the set of eyes required to make prudential decisions like that. For example, the thing about he raised about the transgendered, girls' sports kind of things. I would say if I was a parent and my daughter was involved in sports, competitive sports, say in high school or something, and she had lost a track relay meet to a biological male dressed as a woman, I maybe would speak up, and my motivation would be concern for not just my daughter, but for the well-being of all girls, to save female sports, kind of like Riley Gaines is doing. Her motivation is, even someone like Caitlyn Jenner, but formerly Bruce Jenner, has said we need to get biological males out of women's sports. A lesbian, I think, atheist, Martina Navratilova, the great tennis star, has said we need to get biological males out of this. So, I think it's a legitimate issue. But I can also say that 99% of people out there should probably just keep their mouths shut in terms of speaking at the PTA, right? If you're just going there to be a blowhard, I've got an opinion on this, damn it, and you're going to hear it, then, that's probably not the most Christian of motivations. Go back to your parish, read the Gospels. I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss in those kinds of situations to determine what's the best course. I tend in the direction of saying, to hell with it. I'm not going to speak.
Yeah, it makes sense. But the call to maintain a robust and active prayer life is the important thing there.
Yeah,
and that's what we all need to do more of. So, can I ask, Larry, do you have a set schedule for your prayer life? What does that look like? I think you're a Benedictine Oblate, right?
We are Benedictine Oblates here. We do Liturgy of the Hours. We do morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer. We don't do all the hours. We do those 3 hours. In Lent, I think this coming up next week, we're going to be adding Compline, night prayer. But I also am a big fan, and I do this a lot, of Lectio Divina, praying the scriptures. I do a lot of that, and I just started that a couple of years ago, and I have found it far more. In some sense, I have limited time, so I don't do daily rosary. I know a lot of people do daily rosary. I don't do daily rosary. I do daily scripture reading instead, and that has been more helpful for me.
Nice. A recent resource I've found to be very helpful is this podcast called 10 Minutes with Jesus that's produced by various priests of Opus Dei. And it's just exactly what it sounds like. It's a 10-minute meditation. And I don't know if you've attended an Opus Dei meditation before, Larry, but it's sort of a vocalization talking directly to Jesus. So the priest offers this meditation, and part of it's talking directly to Jesus. Sometimes he sort of directs it to the listener in prayer. But it's a really, really nice way to start a day, end the day, whatever. So I'd recommend that as a resource to listeners who are looking for
That reminds me of the spiritual practice introduced by St. Ignatius, who started the Jesuits, called the colloquy, in which he asks his followers to engage in this practice where you actually engage in a real conversation. You speak to Jesus, you speak to the saints, you speak to Mary as if they're a real person in the room. And he says, over time, what you discover when you engage in this exercise is that you start getting real responses. And you recognize this isn't just you inventing responses. This is Jesus, Mary, and the saints speaking to you. That's kind of a similar thing, it seems to me, to actually verbalize prayers as a conversation with our Lord. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. I didn't know that about Ignatius. I'm not as schooled in Ignatian prayer as I want to be. I've had, a little bit of exposure to it, and what I've loved. So I should dive into that more. It's a great idea. Well, Larry, we're at about time. Any final parting thoughts on this great conversation we've had?
No, except that people should read Paul Kingsnorth. People should read Ross Douthat, and especially these latest articles, because I think there's a lot there.
definitely. I will include both links in the show notes as well. I think they're both potentially paywall, but maybe you get some free articles on both. The Kingsnorth one is in First Things. Douthat is in the Free Press. But I will put links to both in the show notes, so please definitely encourage you to read them. They're great. In the meantime, Larry, really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much for doing
Anytime.
it. Absolutely. Yeah, we'll have you on again soon to talk about any number of things. It's always a pleasure. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, to my listeners, thanks so much for joining for another episode of Creedle. Thanks so much, Larry. Thank you so much to all of you for tuning in. Until next time, God bless you.